Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. This is week 10, so we're studying chapter 9 in our text this week. And this is a really short chapter, but it's a good chapter also. And there's some of it near the end that we'll talk about that we don't have to pay too much attention to. But really, this is sort of the wrap up of the Cold War and bringing us up to date on what's happening in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, really after the war all the way up to current times. And it's interesting for me because I've lived through a lot of this, and for those of you who were born after the Cold War, you can't really relate to what the environment was like. And I think maybe I mentioned to this class before, when I was in elementary school, we did duck and cover drills for nuclear attack and, went through all that Cold War stuff. But the thing I was thinking about as I was reading this chapter was when the Olympics used to be on, when I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, when the Olympics used to be on, the big contest was always between the communist countries and the countries of Western Europe and the U.S. And so that's even how the medals count was always, they would always have the East Germans and the Russians and Czechoslovakia and all of these score columns and the idea of communism versus capitalism. And these two different ideologies permeated everything, but it especially permeated the Olympics, and that's one of my fondest memories, I guess, of the Cold War, because the Olympics were really exciting, and then it was always this American versus, communist, whether it was the Winter Olympics in ice skating or certainly in gymnastics. There's a very rich history of Eastern Europeans and Russian gymnasts, women gymnasts especially, that were amazing, and they were national heroes in those systems. So just sort of an interesting thing to know. Anyway, so the book starts in this chapter, and it talks about Stalin, and we should know who Joseph Stalin was by now. He was the head man of the Communist Party and therefore of the Soviet Union during World War II and after World War II. And really, historians refer to the framework for the country back then not as communist, but as Stalinist. So Stalinism is communism with a particularly brutal side to it, and Stalin had taken any political dissidents or anyone who disagreed with him and would send them up to the gulags up in Siberia. And so a lot of political dissidents were either murdered or, sent up to Siberia during Stalin's administration because, they were very hardcore communists. That was the doctrine they lived under. And after the war, of course, and we already talked about this, but a lot of the Eastern European countries aligned with Russia or Soviet Union, and they really didn't have any choice there. And so if you look at countries like Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia, again, is another one, or Ukraine, those were all Soviet satellites. So when you look at that name, the United Soviet Republics, the USSR, all of those republics were what they're referring to as all of those countries that were under Soviet domination, or behind the Iron Curtain is another way to say it. So the chapter opens with Stalin, and it talks about after he died, Nikita Khrushchev comes into office, and Khrushchev was a little bit of a reformer, but not so much. He was hardcore capitalist, or hardcore communist. But he came to the U.S. and toured the U.S. and had debates, with Kennedy and with Nixon, and there's a little YouTube video link in the reading notes that you should look at because it shows you Khrushchev's trip to the U.S. and it's pretty funny. There's a great picture in there with Nikita Khrushchev sitting on one seat in the back seat of a limo, and then Dwight David Eisenhower in the middle, and then Khrushchev's wife on the other side. These two big Russians with Eisenhower wedged in the middle, and Eisenhower doesn't look happy about it. So check out the pictures, check out the video, if you will. And so Khrushchev, led the country for quite some time, but really mishandled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Communist Party basically votes him out over that. And he didn't make a lot of friends with the Communist Party anyway because he was a little bit too reform-minded. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis debacle, which really characterized the Russians in a weak light because we blockaded the ships from going to Cuba, and the Russian ships backed down. They turned around. So that didn't go over well with the main dudes of the Communist Party. So next thing you know, Khrushchev is out, and then Leonid Brezhnev comes in, and Brezhnev was in power for I think 64 to in the 80s, 82 maybe, and he was more like Stalin in that he really repressed any government critics. If anyone came out, there's no free speech. So if anyone came out, said anything bad about the government, again, up to the gulags in Siberia. And after he sort of cracked down on any reforms and reinforced no freedom of the press and no criticism and no religion, I mean, no worshiping, because that's part of the communist doctrine. Also, he was hardcore. And the problem was during Brezhnev's administration is that the economy sucked. And the economy had been bad in the Soviet Union for a long time. And there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of reasons why. Most people in the West will say, well, it proves that communism doesn't work, or it proves that socialism or Marxism doesn't work. But I think if you look at the bigger picture, Russia, the Soviet Union back then, was just this massive landmass. I mean, bigger than anything else on Earth. Most of it was uninhabited up in Siberia, but at the same time, you had this vast array of cultures, vast array of people, and it was mainly rural. And there was really no education in any of these rural areas. So, again, there wasn't intelligent communication between people. And at the same time, 75% of the entire group of all of those countries was agrarian. So, we're talking about, poor, illiterate farmers. And it's tough to build a communist economy off of that, because the whole core of the communist economy, what Marxist people were thinking about, or what Karl Marx was thinking about when he talked about communism and how it would work, he was really talking about industrial economies. And so the economy in the Soviet Union, was never going to work, because you just didn't have a basis of manufacturing that could produce revenue. In order to have an economy, you got to have revenue. It's like working, in order to buy stuff, you have to have a paycheck. And so the Soviet Union economy continually suffered, but it was very dependent upon oil. The Soviet Union has the largest oil reserves in the world, and back then they were being developed in the 50s and 60s. Right now, they're still some of the largest in the world, which is a good thing. But the bad thing is the fortunes of the Soviet Union back then and the fortunes of the Russian Federation right now depend on oil reserves, which, they have a lot of oil, so that's good, but oil is so volatile in pricing, and right now their economy is really suffering because of the drop-off in oil prices. So that's the case now, and that was the case back then. And I think there's a quiz question maybe about oil being their main source of revenue. So there you go. Anyway, so I was talking about Brezhnev and the poor economy, and by the time the late 80s comes, the economy is really in free fall in Russia. Brezhnev dies at 82 years old, and two more leaders come in. Andropov is one of them, and Chernenko is the next. And between the two of them, they spent hardly any time as leaders of the Russians. So they're not insignificant, but they came in next. And I think what you see after Brezhnev and then Andropov and especially Chernenko is, trying to struggle with this economy. But the core issue was that under the communist system, there was no innovation, there was no incentive. Everybody worked for the state. So if you worked for a university, your checks were coming from the federal government. If you worked in a shoe factory, your checks were coming from the federal government. So everyone worked for the state. And when that happens, there's no incentive to produce more. There's no incentive for a factory owner to produce more, because there is no factory owner. The factory owners are state people, or everything's run by the state. So the fundamental problems with the economy in the USSR really didn't have as much to do with the leadership, but the framework of communism and this agrarian economy that never had anything more than oil to generate revenue. I mean, the Soviet products were terrible, and so they had no export market. I mean, no one was going to buy a Soviet car or a refrigerator or anything like that. And the book even talks about one of the reasons equality is so bad, because the workers didn't care, because whether they did good work or bad work, they were getting paid by the state. It didn't really matter. So that's a larger commentary on the communist economy, I think. But you should make note of it, because by time the 80s come, 1989, that economy is going to catch up with them, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So the chapter opens with all this Russian stuff, and I took you through these leaders and what was going on, and then it goes into what's going on in Eastern Europe. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the map, Eastern Europe in this case, just think of Poland, think of Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia. You think of those countries as Eastern Europe. And as you may or may not remember, as I just talked about, after World War II, the Soviets occupied all these areas. And if they didn't occupy them, they put their own puppet governments in place to serve as a buffer, if you will, a security blanket. But also a number of these other countries, had commodities and resources, and they were also very strategic from a military standpoint. But what's happening, and this shouldn't surprise anyone, when these Eastern European countries are under the control of the Soviet Union, rebellions break out. Like in Poland in the 50s, for example, food prices went way up, and there was a big crackdown that you couldn't practice Catholicism. And, anytime you have that, the people are going to rebel. So that happened in Poland in the 50s, a real ugly rebellion in Hungary in the 1950s. And I'm Hungarian, by the way, and I can say Nem kell tojás. And if someone in the class can tell me what that means, I'll give them extra points, so you can get back to me on that. Anyway, but Hungary, Poland, Romania, all sort of repressed by Stalin and then by Khrushchev and Brezhnev. There are rebellions breaking out, and the Soviet Union, in some cases, sends in, especially in Hungary, sends in the army to straighten out the rebellion and rebuild the government. And some of these countries, like after Poland was one of the first rebellions, and after that rebellion, really the rebels in Romania, really looked to see if the U.S. would get involved or not, because if they would have, then some of these other countries would have thought, hey, you know what, if we stand up and fight against the Soviets, the U.S. is going to come and help us. But the U.S. had no intention of doing that under Truman or under Eisenhower, because they knew that the potential was there to set off a nuclear war. So that's really why the U.S. really didn't get involved in these early rebellions. But so that really kind of leads us all the way up to this history of rebellions, especially in Hungary and Poland, and then we get to Lech Walesa, who is a union leader in Poland, and in the 80s, he goes on strikes goes on strike and speaks up against the Soviet Union, and the Polish authorities don't do anything. So as you get into the 80s, you start to see these rebellions getting more serious, and the Soviet Union or the governments of these puppet states, Poland, Hungary, not doing anything either. And one of the reasons for that was that the Soviet Union was out of money, and no one really knew it at the time how bad things were. But they couldn't support these military incursions anymore because they were out of money. So after Chernenko dies in 1985, a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev takes over, and I remember him, growing up and seeing him on TV, and he was like a totally different leader, a real moderate and modern Russian leader, and he was smart, and he looked around at the economy, the world economy, and trying to hold all of these states together, and understood that the USSR, the Soviet Union, wasn't sustainable in its current state. The economy was crushed, and if you wanted to do any reforms, it would have to be in the sense of opening up markets, letting people sell goods, letting people own private property, which you can't do in a communist country. So he started to enact some very radical reforms, and met with Ronald Reagan. I remember when that was happening, worked on these arms deals and denuclearization, if you will. So Gorbachev was a good guy, was really different, but at the same time, he was too much of a reformer too fast. and eventually he resigned because he had no support from the party anymore. But at the same time, the country was falling apart, and so after he resigned, a guy named Boris Yeltsin came in. And he did not come from the Communist Party. He was a city official, and he was crazy. I remember watching him on TV. Very animated guy. He showed up intoxicated a few times, and it was really obvious, and really wasn't taken seriously by a lot of people. But he was like, hey, we're getting rid of all vestiges of communism and turning this thing into a free market economy, which was great, but he tried too much too quickly. And, you just can't go from a communist state and a government-controlled economy and government-controlled industries to free market capitalism overnight. And Yeltsin tried to do that, and it was a total failure. And one of the reasons it was a failure was because he never got the buy-in from the people. I mean, he never, they never had a campaign to tell everybody, hey, things are going to be really bad for a little while the economy's transitioning. And, the public didn't know that, and the economy, again, suffered because people that could afford to buy businesses and invest in other new private enterprises were all the oligarchs. And you hear about the oligarchs now, but there's a number of Russians who are very wealthy who, when Yeltsin came along and kind of opened everything up for sale, if you will, some of these guys bought huge state industries. Like, one guy bought the Soviet oil industry, the whole thing, because it was all state run before, or someone could buy like the Soviet steel industry, all of it. So you'll hear about oligarchs in the news these days, sometimes involved with our current politics. And a lot of these oligarchs came out of the Yeltsin era, who got really rich by buying stuff. But overall, the economy really suffered, and the people were starting to rise up and kind of said, you know what? When we were under communism, it sucked, but now that we're under this transitional thing under Yeltsin, it sucks even more. So we want to go back to a stricter economic program. And a guy named Vladimir Putin comes along in 1999, and he was a former KGB agent. So that's like the CIA for Russia, if you will, and is a hardcore communist and was really involved in the Communist Party, and obviously is still in office today, and has really kind of cracked down on some of the Yeltsin reforms. But at the same time, his buddies, the oligarchs that support him, they all have this sort of cabal going too, and he's got a lot of money. They all have a lot of money, and you hear about Putin in the news all the time. So there's that. So that's, the chapter ends with this disintegration of the Soviet Empire. So the really big deal there, as you recall, East and West Germany were separated after World War II, with East Germany aligning with the communists. And then I didn't talk about it, but the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and that was a big symbolic deal. And I remember watching that on TV and how these East Germans were so happy to be able to come and go. And essentially, with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, historians say the Cold War was over in 1989 when the wall fell. That's not true as far as this historian is concerned, because now you have these two superpowers still building nuclear weapons. We still have missiles pointed at each other. Really, nothing's changed, and we've witnessed that in Afghanistan. We've witnessed that in Ukraine, in Crimea in the past 5 years. So the Cold War is still going on, but since historians declared it ended in 1989, now they got to figure out a new word or something for it, and they haven't done that yet. But a lot of this stuff that was happening is still happening, and it's an interesting transition, because these countries that were part of the USSR in the past, especially like Ukraine, there's still rebel forces there and a lot of internal strife, and the economies aren't good in a lot of these places because they never had that innovation or that capitalist manufacturing base. So that's it for this chapter. A good chapter, kind of ties in what we talked about last week and is getting us up to date in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So hope you enjoyed it. There's a quiz this week. Let me see. It's real easy. Some of the stuff I just talked about. So there's a question about why Soviet consumers and the Soviet economy suffered And you can figure it out when you read the book, but the hint is that they spent a heck of a lot of money on defense, and I'll just leave it at that. So there's that one. There's a question about why Khrushchev was voted out of office, and I just mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, so that one's pretty easy. The other one is, why didn't the U.S. assist Poland or Hungary during the uprisings of the 50s and 60s? So I already talked about that one. And what is the main commodity of the Soviet economy? We talked about that. And then we also talked about the current leader, Putin, and sort of who was in office before him, so you should be familiar with that. So that's it for this week. If you have any questions, let me know, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.